You ever notice how everything starts pushing back harder right before something good happens in your life? That's not random, that's resistance, because the enemy doesn't fight people who are losing. He fights the ones who are about to win. The pressure you're feeling, the delays, the distractions, the sudden battles you didn't see coming, they're not signs that you're failing, they're signs you're close. Close to breakthrough, close to elevation, close to the version of you that finally stops surviving and starts winning. And here's the truth you need to hold on to. If you weren't dangerous to what's been holding you back, you wouldn't be under attack like this. So don't fold now. Don't slow down. You're not being broken. You're being prepared for victory. When resistance starts increasing in your life, it rarely shows up in an obvious way that says something good is coming. It usually shows up disguised as confusion, delay, stress, or unexpected problems that seem to appear all at once. Things that were moving smoothly suddenly feel stuck. People you thought would support you start acting distant. Plans you were confident about begin to shake. And in that moment, most people assume something is going wrong, but what they don't realize is that this is often the exact point where something is about to go right. Resistance doesn't appear randomly. It has timing. And strangely enough, it tends to show up when you are closest to a breakthrough, not when you are far from it. Think about it like this. When nothing important is happening in your life, there's usually not much pushback either. You're not being challenged because you're not moving toward anything that threatens your current level. But the moment you start leveling up, mentally, spiritually, emotionally, financially, something shifts. It's like life itself starts to test whether you are ready to handle what you're asking for. That resistance can feel personal, but it often isn't. It's not always about you doing something wrong. It's about you doing something right for long enough that change is finally within reach. And change, real change, always triggers friction, because growth is not comfortable for the part of you that is used to survival mode. It stretches you. It exposes weaknesses. It forces you to confront habits, fears, and doubts you were able to ignore before. This is why resistance often feels heavier right before a breakthrough. It's not because you are getting weaker, it's because you are getting closer. Imagine pushing a heavy door that hasn't been opened in years. At first, it feels impossible. You push and nothing moves. You might even think it's locked, but what you don't realize is that the resistance you feel isn't proof that the door won't open. It's just proof that it hasn't been opened in a long time. And if you keep pushing, even when it feels stuck, there comes a moment where it suddenly gives way. That sudden release is what breakthrough feels like. But most people quit just before that moment because the resistance convinced them it wasn't working. In life, resistance often behaves the same way. It builds pressure right before release. It intensifies right before progress becomes visible. And if you don't understand that pattern, you can mistake pressure for failure. You can start questioning yourself. You can start thinking you're not capable, not chosen, not ready. But in reality, you may be standing at the exact edge of transformation. The hardest part is that resistance doesn't announce its purpose. It doesn't say, I'm here to test you before your next level. Instead, it shows up in forms that feel discouraging, delays that make you doubt your timing, rejections that make you question your worth, obstacles that make you wonder if you took the wrong path. But none of those things automatically mean stop. Sometimes they simply mean strengthen. Because the truth is, you don't rise to your breakthrough by avoiding resistance. You rise through it. Every challenge you endure without giving up builds a deeper level of strength inside you. Every moment you choose to keep going when it would be easier to quit reshapes your mindset. You start becoming someone who doesn't break under pressure, but instead learns how to move through it. And maybe the most important thing to understand is this: resistance often shows up when what you're becoming is no longer compatible with where you've been. That discomfort you feel is not just external. It's internal transformation trying to complete itself. You are outgrowing an old version of life, and anything that can't go with you starts to feel heavy, difficult, or uncertain. So when resistance rises, it is not the time to assume you're failing. It is the time to recognize that something is shifting, because nothing significant ever comes without opposition trying to delay it. And the more meaningful your next step is, the more it will feel like everything is trying to stop you from taking it. But if you keep going anyway, if you keep pushing through the weight, the doubt, and the noise, you eventually reach that point where resistance breaks instead of you. And that is where breakthrough begins. When pressure starts building in your life, it rarely feels like a compliment. It feels like weight on your chest, like everything is happening at once, like no matter how hard you try, something else is pushing back even harder. And in that state, it's very easy to misunderstand what pressure actually is. Most people assume pressure means they are about to break. But in reality, pressure is often the exact environment where growth is happening the fastest. Think about anything that is built to last: steel, diamonds, strong foundations. None of them are formed in comfort. They are formed under pressure, under conditions that force transformation. And the same principle applies to people. You don't become stronger in moments where everything is easy. You become stronger in moments where everything is demanding more from you than you think you can give. Pressure shows up when life starts asking you to operate at a higher level than before. It forces decisions, it exposes habits, it reveals how you react when things don't go your way, and while it feels overwhelming, it is actually shaping you into someone who can handle more than you currently are. That's why pressure often increases right before something important happens. It's preparing you for it. The strange thing about pressure is that it doesn't always come from one direction. Sometimes it's financial stress, sometimes it's emotional exhaustion, sometimes it's uncertainty about the future, and sometimes it's all of it at once, making it feel like there is no space to breathe. But what you don't always see in that moment is that pressure is not just attacking you, it is also refining you. Because pressure has a way of stripping away everything unnecessary. It removes distractions, it forces clarity, it pushes you to focus on what actually matters instead of what is comfortable. And even though it feels uncomfortable, that discomfort is what forces growth to happen faster than it ever would in ease. If you look closely at your most difficult moments in life, you'll often realize they were also the moments that changed you the most, not because they were easy, but because they demanded something deeper from you. They required resilience you didn't know you had. They forced you to think differently, act differently, and sometimes even become someone you didn't recognize at first. That is what pressure does. It introduces you to a stronger version of yourself. But here's where most people struggle. When pressure builds, they assume it means something is going wrong. They think, if things were meant to work out, why would it feel this hard? But that question comes from misunderstanding how growth works. Growth rarely feels like alignment at first. It often feels like tension because you are being stretched beyond what you were before. Imagine a muscle being trained. The resistance it feels during a workout is not a signal to stop. It is the exact signal that it is being strengthened. Without that resistance, there is no growth. And the same is true for your life. Without pressure, there is no expansion. The problem is not the pressure itself. The problem is when pressure convinces you to quit too early, because pressure has a timing. It increases before progress becomes visible. It intensifies before results show up. And if you don't understand that timing, you might give up right before the shift happens. There is also something deeper happening under pressure that most people don't notice. It changes your identity. It forces you to stop relying on comfort and start relying on discipline. It pushes you to build habits that don't depend on motivation. It teaches you how to keep moving even when things don't feel stable. And that version of you, the one that keeps going under pressure, is the version that actually reaches breakthrough. Pressure is not just about what is happening around you. It is about what is being built within you. And sometimes the reason it feels so intense is because you are closer to something bigger than you realize. Life doesn't usually test people at random moments. It tends to test them at transition points when they are about to step into a new level, a new responsibility, a new direction. That's why pressure often feels like everything is closing in right before something opens up. So instead of seeing pressure as a sign to stop, it may be more accurate to see it as a sign that something important is being prepared. Not always immediately visible, not always easy to understand, but always meaningful in the long run. Because pressure doesn't come to destroy you, it comes to reveal you. When life starts hitting you with unexpected problems one after another, it's easy to believe that something is going wrong. Plans change, doors close, people shift, timing feels off, and suddenly everything that once felt stable starts feeling uncertain. In those moments, it can seem like you're being pushed backward instead of forward, but often what feels like disruption is actually direction. You just can't see where it's leading yet. Unexpected problems have a way of shaking your confidence because they interrupt your sense of control. You thought you understood the path, and then something happens that doesn't fit your plan. A delay, a rejection, a sudden change, and instantly your mind tries to interpret it as failure. But not every interruption is a setback. Some interruptions are redirections that are too early to understand. Think about how often the most important shifts in life don't come through smooth progress, but through moments that forced you to pause and rethink everything. At the time, they felt frustrating. They felt like obstacles that didn't belong in your story. But later, when you look back, you realize those moments were actually protecting you, shaping you, or pushing you towards something you wouldn't have chosen on your own. Unexpected problems often appear right when you are becoming too comfortable with your current direction. You settle into a rhythm, you start believing things will continue the same way, and then suddenly something breaks that pattern. It forces you to stop assuming and start paying attention again. And while it feels disruptive, it also prevents stagnation, because without disruption, growth can quietly stop without you even noticing. There is also a deeper layer to unexpected problems. They reveal what you are anchored to. When things go wrong, what is the first thing that breaks inside you? Is it your patience, your faith, your discipline, your clarity? Those moments don't just show you the problem, they show you yourself. They reveal the areas that are still developing, still fragile, still untested. And that awareness, although uncomfortable, is one of the most important parts of growth. Because if everything always went according to plan, you would never discover what needs strengthening. Unexpected problems also tend to show up when something new is being built in your life, not because the new thing is wrong, but because transition is rarely smooth. When you are moving from one level of life to another, there is always a phase where things don't fully match. Old systems don't work anymore, but new systems aren't fully in place yet. That in-between space feels unstable, but it is actually a sign that change is happening. It's like construction. When a building is being renovated or expanded, it doesn't look complete for a while. There is noise, dust, temporary inconvenience, and visible disruption. But that disruption is not destruction, it is progress in motion. And life works the same way. Sometimes what looks like everything falling apart is actually everything being rebuilt. The challenge is that during unexpected problems, clarity is usually missing. You don't see the full picture. You only see the immediate issue. And in that limited view, it's easy to assume the situation is bigger than your ability to handle it. But most problems feel larger when you are inside them than they actually are in the bigger timeline of your life. What helps is remembering that not every problem is meant to be solved instantly. Some problems are meant to be processed. They are meant to slow you down enough to rethink your direction, to refine your approach, or to prepare you for something you didn't anticipate. And sometimes unexpected problems are not blocking your path. They are preventing you from going down the wrong one. There are moments in life where you are trying to move forward in a direction that looks right on the surface, but something keeps interfering. You don't understand why things aren't working out, why the effort isn't producing results, why there is constant resistance. And only later do you realize that what felt like delay was actually protection from a path that wasn't aligned with where you needed to end up. That doesn't always make it easier in the moment, because when you are in the middle of uncertainty, you don't have the benefit of hindsight. You only have questions, but even without answers, you still have the ability to respond with patience, awareness, and steadiness. Unexpected problems test that steadiness. They test whether you will panic or pause, whether you will quit or adjust, whether you will assume the worst or stay open to a different outcome than the one you expected. And often the difference between people who break under pressure and people who grow through it is not the absence of problems, it is how they interpret them. Because one person sees unexpected problems as proof that nothing is working. Another person sees them as part of a process that is still unfolding. And that shift in interpretation changes everything. So when things don't go according to plan, it doesn't always mean you are off track. Sometimes it means the track is being adjusted in real time. Sometimes it means the path you thought you were on is being replaced with something better suited for where you are actually going. Not everything that interrupts you is against you. Some things are quietly working in your favor, even if they don't feel like it yet. When progress becomes real in your life, something interesting happens. It stops being quiet. At the beginning, when you're just thinking, planning, or hoping, everything feels internal and invisible. There's little resistance because there's little impact. But the moment your actions start turning into results, even small ones, the energy around you changes. Things feel harder, doubts get louder, delays appear more often, and suddenly it seems like everything is pushing back against you at once. This is usually where people get confused. They assume that if they were truly on the right path, things would start getting easier. But real progress doesn't always reduce opposition. It often reveals it. Because before you were moving forward, there was nothing to respond to. Now that you are moving, something is reacting to that movement. And that reaction is what you feel as opposition. Opposition becomes noticeable when your efforts are no longer theoretical, when your work starts producing visible change, when your discipline starts showing results, when your consistency starts building momentum. That's when resistance shows up in a more direct form. It's almost as if the environment adjusts itself to test whether you are serious about the direction you've chosen. At that stage, even small obstacles can feel amplified. A delay that you would normally ignore suddenly feels significant. A setback that you would usually recover from quickly feels heavier. Not because the problems are necessarily bigger, but because your expectations have risen. You can see progress now, so anything that interrupts it feels more personal. But opposition is not always a sign that you are off track. In many cases, it is a sign that you are finally on a track that matters, because systems, habits, environments, and even internal doubts tend to respond differently when something real is being built. It's like pressure increases around anything that has the potential to grow beyond its current limits. And here's what most people miss. Opposition doesn't usually show up to stop people who are stuck. It shows up to test people who are moving. When nothing is happening, there is no need for resistance. But when you begin to move with clarity and direction, when your actions start aligning with intention, when your consistency starts producing visible change, that movement itself creates friction. Not because you are doing something wrong, but because momentum always interacts with resistance in some form. At first, that friction can feel discouraging. You might start questioning why things aren't smoother, why progress feels harder now than when you were just planning, why after finally starting to see results, things suddenly feel more complicated. But that's often the stage where reality is no longer neutral toward your growth, it is responding to it. And opposition doesn't always come in dramatic forms. Sometimes it is subtle, a lack of support from people you expected encouragement from, unexpected delays that slow your pace, mental fatigue that feels heavier than usual, distractions that suddenly seem more tempting. These are not always random. They often appear at the point where your consistency is beginning to create change. It's important to understand that progress and resistance are not opposites. They often exist together. The presence of one can intensify the experience of the other. That's why it can feel like things are getting harder exactly when you are starting to do better. Because now what you are building is no longer invisible. And when something becomes visible, it becomes measurable. When it becomes measurable, it becomes vulnerable to pressure. That doesn't mean it's failing. It means it is now part of the real world where everything that grows also gets tested. Opposition also has a way of revealing how committed you actually are. When things are easy, almost anyone can continue. But when resistance increases, when obstacles appear in clusters, when progress slows just enough to make you question yourself, that is where consistency becomes meaningful. Because now you are not just moving forward when it feels good, you are choosing to continue even when it doesn't. That choice is where real progress is shaped. And something else happens during increased opposition. You begin to see what your effort is made of. If your progress depends only on motivation, it becomes fragile. If it depends on discipline, it becomes stable. Opposition exposes that difference very clearly. It shows whether you are building something temporary or something that can withstand pressure. There is also a psychological shift that happens when opposition intensifies. You start to realize that growth is not a straight line. It's not a smooth rise without interruption. It is a process that includes resistance as part of its structure. And once you accept that, the presence of opposition stops feeling like a warning sign and starts feeling like a stage of development. Because not all resistance is meant to stop you. Some resistance is meant to confirm that what you are doing is significant enough to be challenged. And if you can stay steady in that phase, if you can continue without letting opposition rewrite your direction, you often reach a point where the resistance no longer has the same effect. Not because it disappears, but because you stop interpreting it as a reason to slow down. At that point, opposition loses its influence, and progress becomes stronger than the resistance around it. Staying consistent through resistance is rarely about motivation. Motivation is what gets you started when things feel exciting, when the vision is clear, when the energy is high. But resistance doesn't show up in those moments. It shows up after the excitement fades, after the initial push, when what remains is repetition, discipline, and the quiet decision to continue even when nothing feels instantly rewarding. Consistency becomes meaningful precisely because it is tested. It is not proven in easy seasons. It is proven when there is pressure to stop, when progress feels slow, when results are delayed, when doubt starts whispering louder than confidence. That is where most people lose momentum, not because they are incapable, but because they misinterpret resistance as a signal to quit rather than a stage to move through. When you are consistently moving forward in the middle of resistance, you're doing something most people underestimate. You are separating emotion from direction, because in that space, feelings are unreliable. Some days you feel like you're getting somewhere. Other days it feels like nothing is working at all. But consistency is not built on how you feel. It is built on what you decide to do, regardless of how you feel. Resistance has a way of testing that decision repeatedly. It shows up in different forms, not always dramatic, but persistent enough to challenge your rhythm. A delay here, a setback there, a distraction that pulls your attention away just enough to break focus. And if consistency is fragile, it breaks easily in those moments. But if it is built deeply, it holds. What most people don't realize is that resistance often arrives at the exact point where consistency is starting to create real change. Before that point, there is little opposition because there is little impact. But once your actions begin to shape outcomes, once your habits begin to produce visible direction in your life, that is when everything that doesn't align with your progress starts to feel heavier. This is where consistency becomes a quiet form of strength, not loud, not dramatic, but steady. It is the decision to show up again after disappointment, to continue after delay, to keep moving even when results are not immediate. And over time, that repetition builds something internal that resistance cannot easily shake. Because consistency doesn't just change outcomes, it changes identity. The more you stay consistent through resistance, the less you identify as someone who reacts, and the more you become someone who persists. And that shift is powerful. It means your behavior is no longer dependent on conditions. It means your direction is no longer controlled by temporary difficulty. There is also something subtle that happens when you remain consistent during resistance. You start to build evidence for yourself, not external validation, but internal proof that you can continue even when it's hard. That proof becomes important later because the mind remembers how you responded under pressure. And each time you choose consistency over quitting, that memory strengthens. Resistance in that sense becomes a training ground. It forces repetition under less than ideal conditions. It forces you to act without certainty. It forces you to trust process over immediate results. And while that feels uncomfortable in the moment, it builds resilience that cannot be formed in comfort. It's also important to understand that consistency through resistance does not mean absence of struggle. It does not mean you don't feel tired, frustrated, or uncertain. It means those feelings no longer control your direction. You acknowledge them, but you don't surrender your progress to them. You keep going anyway, even if the pace is slower, even if the steps feel heavier. And over time, something changes in how resistance affects you. What once felt like a stopping point begins to feel like a passing phase. What once felt overwhelming begins to feel manageable. Not because the resistance disappears, but because you become accustomed to moving through it instead of reacting to it. That is the quiet power of consistency. It changes your threshold. It expands what you can handle without breaking your rhythm. It teaches you that progress is not about avoiding difficulty, but about continuing despite it. There is a moment in every meaningful journey where consistency starts to outlast resistance, where the effort you have already put in begins to outweigh the pressure trying to stop you. And when you reach that point, something shifts internally. You stop negotiating with difficulty. You stop debating whether to continue. You simply continue. And that is where real progress stabilizes. Because consistency is not about perfect performance. It is about repeated commitment. It is about showing up enough times that resistance loses its ability to define your direction. And when that happens, what once felt like opposition becomes background noise to a path you are no longer willing to abandon.